In the summer of 1984, a construction crew was clearing land near Titusville, Florida, to make way for new housing. Nobody expected anything unusual. It was just another patch of swampy ground that needed to be leveled before the bulldozers could move in. But when the operator of a backhoe named Steve Vanderjack lowered his bucket into a small, murky pond, he pulled up something that stopped the entire project cold. Sitting in the mud was a round object about the size of a coconut. He climbed down to get a closer look, expecting a stone or a chunk of old wood. Instead, he found himself staring into the hollow eye sockets of a human skull. His first thought was the obvious one. Somebody had been killed and dumped in that pond. He called the police, and soon enough a local coroner arrived to examine the skull. But something about it didn't fit a typical crime scene. The bone wasn't just old and weathered, it was stained a deep brown from years of sitting in organic muck. The coroner realized this wasn't a murder investigation. This was something else entirely, and it needed a specialist who understood bones far older than any homicide case would involve. That call went out to Florida State University, where a young academic named Glenn Doran was teaching. Doran studied ancient skeletons for a living, and when he got the message about strange remains turning up in a swamp, he drove out without much enthusiasm. He'd seen plenty of ordinary sights before, and this pond, small, stagnant, and surrounded by scrubby brush, didn't look like it was hiding anything remarkable. He was wrong. Walking along the edge of the water, Doran began spotting bone fragments poking out of the peat, the thick, spongy layer of decayed plant matter that lines the bottom of bogs like this one. Within a short time, he'd located several more skulls. When he examined the teeth, he noticed heavy, unusual wear, the kind you get from using your teeth as tools rather than simply from chewing food. That detail told him immediately that these weren't modern remains. People stopped grinding down their teeth like that a very long time ago. Lab tests confirmed his suspicion in a way nobody was fully prepared for. The bones dated back roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years. To put that into perspective, these people died thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt were built and thousands of years before Stonehenge was assembled in England. The excitement among the research team was enormous, but so was the challenge sitting right in front of them. The remains were still submerged in a pond filled with millions of gallons of water. You can't excavate delicate ancient bone underwater with regular digging tools, and if the bones were pulled out and exposed to open air too quickly, they could crumble apart within hours. So the team spent close to 2 years designing a system to solve the problem. They installed roughly 150 well points around the site and ran pumps continuously, draining hundreds of gallons of water every minute till the floor of the bog was finally exposed. What they uncovered wasn't a handful of unlucky individuals who happened to end up in the mud. It was an entire burial ground. Bodies kept emerging one after another, most of them curled into a fetal position, clearly placed there on purpose rather than dumped. By the time the dig was finished, the team had recovered 168 individuals. Men, women, and children, spanning every stage of life. Testing on the layers of peat surrounding the burials showed something even more remarkable. This wasn't a one-time event or a mass tragedy. People had been returning to this exact spot to bury their dead for roughly 300 years, generation after generation, longer than most modern countries have even existed. The next big question was obvious. How on earth had any of this survived so long? Bone is organic. Left in warm, wet, acidic soil, it typically breaks down and disappears within a few decades, sometimes faster. Florida's climate should have made preservation nearly impossible. Yet these skeletons looked, according to the forensic experts who examined them, almost recently deceased. The answer came down to chemistry. The pond was a peat bog, meaning its floor was made of centuries of compressed, decayed plant material that created a low oxygen environment. Bacteria and fungi, the organisms responsible for breaking down organic material, can't survive well without oxygen, so decomposition slowed to a crawl. On top of that, unlike many peat bogs around the world that are highly acidic and tend to dissolve bone even while preserving skin and hair, this particular bog had a neutral, non-acidic chemistry. That rare combination meant both soft tissue and skeletal material could survive side by side for thousands of years. It was, in effect, a natural time capsule, one that had been sealed by accident rather than by design. As the excavation progressed, the researchers noticed something strange about several of the skulls. They were far too heavy. Bone alone doesn't weigh that much, so there had to be something inside. When they looked, they found a dense, pale substance filling the cranial cavity. At first, everyone assumed it was simply hardened peat that had seeped in over the millennia. It seemed like the only logical explanation. It wasn't peat. One skull, belonging to a woman who had died around the age of 45, was sent for medical imaging. The scan revealed a structure far too organized to be sediment. When scientists carefully extracted the material, they realized they were looking at an actual human brain, shrunken down to a fraction of its original size, but still holding its shape, its folds, its basic architecture. It was a genuine ancient human brain, thousands of years old, intact enough to study under a microscope. That discovery alone would have been extraordinary on its own, but it turned out not to be a fluke. By the end of the project, the team had recovered 91 preserved brains from the site, 91 actual organs that had once processed thoughts, memories, fears, and plans, all belonging to people who lived at the dawn of recorded history. And because the human brain hasn't changed structurally in well over 100,000 years, these weren't primitive, half-formed minds. They were biologically identical to yours and mine. Whatever these people experienced, loved, feared, or believed, they processed it using the exact same kind of brain we use today. That realization pushed a geneticist on the team, Bill Houseworth, to ask a bold question. If the cellular structure inside these brains had survived this long, was there any chance the genetic material inside those cells had survived too? DNA is famously fragile. It breaks down under heat, moisture, and time, and 8,000 years is an eternity for a molecule that delicate. Still, he decided it was worth trying. The process involved breaking down small samples of the ancient brain tissue using enzymes designed to release whatever genetic material remained locked inside the cells. Nobody on the team expected much. Environments like Florida's swamps are notoriously bad for DNA preservation compared to something like frozen Siberian permafrost. But when the results came back, they were undeniably positive. There was human DNA in that tissue, genuine, extractable, sequenceable genetic material from a brain that had been sitting in a swamp since roughly 3,000 years before the pyramids. Before celebrating, Houseworth had to rule out the most common problem in ancient DNA work: contamination. Modern human DNA from the researchers handling the samples can easily slip in and produce a false result, one that looks ancient but isn't. To check, he compared the recovered sequences against known genetic markers from different global populations. The match was clear and specific. This DNA carried genetic markers distinctly associated with Native American populations, a signature clearly different from European, African, or Asian genetic profiles. Since none of the lab staff handling the specimens shared that ancestry, contamination could essentially be ruled out. What they had was real. At the time, it stood as some of the oldest confirmed human DNA ever recovered anywhere on the planet. The genetic data did more than confirm the sequences were ancient. It painted a picture of who these people actually were: dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin, a physical profile matching present-day indigenous populations of the Americas. This wasn't some vanished, unrelated group with no connection to anyone living today. These people were direct ancestors. The same genetic thread that ran through their brains still runs through Native American communities today. They weren't a strange prologue to history. They were the beginning of a line that never actually broke. Using the skull of one woman, believed to have lived to around 70 years old, one of the oldest individuals found at the site, researchers built a full facial reconstruction. They scanned her skull, layered in tissue depth data, and used the genetic information to guide the final details. When Glenn Doran, who had spent 2 decades studying this woman's bones without ever knowing what she looked like, finally saw the reconstructed face appear on a screen, it must have felt like meeting someone who had been waiting 8,000 years to be recognized. For a long time, the popular image of prehistoric hunter-gatherers has been one of struggle, short lifespans, malnourishment, a constant fight just to survive. The skeletons at this Florida site told a very different story. Many of the men stood close to 6 feet tall, and bone density across the population pointed to solid, consistent health. This wasn't a group barely scraping by. Florida at the time was rich with rivers, wildlife, and coastal food sources, and it clearly showed in their physical condition. Scientists dug even deeper using a technique called isotope analysis, which measures chemical signatures left behind by the water someone drank throughout their life. Since water chemistry varies depending on geography, this method can reveal where a person actually lived, not just where they died. When researchers compared the isotope signatures in the human bones to those of local animals recovered from the same bog, the results didn't match. The animals reflected the local water supply. The humans didn't. That meant these people weren't permanent residents of the swamp at all. They were a mobile group, moving seasonally across the Florida peninsula, drinking from many different water sources throughout the year, and returning to this one specific pond again and again, purely to bury their dead. That deliberate, repeated pilgrimage tells you something important about how they viewed death. Alongside many of the burials, researchers found jewelry, tools, and weapons placed carefully with the bodies, not scattered or accidental, but positioned with clear intention. That kind of care suggests a belief in some form of continuation after death, a reason to prepare the deceased for whatever came next. The pond itself may have held spiritual significance, functioning almost like a threshold between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond it. Then came another discovery that reshaped assumptions even further. Several skeletons were found wrapped in woven fabric. For a long time, the accepted wisdom in archaeology was that textile weaving came much later in human history, tied to settled farming societies rather than mobile hunter-gatherer groups. A leading textile expert examined the material directly and confirmed it. This was genuine woven fabric, using a twined technique, making it the oldest textile ever discovered in the Americas. Looking closer at the fabric revealed something even more moving. On adult burials, the cloth showed clear signs of wear, meaning it had been used as everyday clothing during the person's life before being buried with them. But on infant burials, the fabric showed almost no wear at all. It had been freshly made, specifically for the burial itself. Someone had taken the time to weave brand new cloth for a child who never got the chance to wear anything out. That's not primitive behavior. That's grief, expressed through skill and effort. Perhaps the clearest evidence of this community's compassion came from a single skeleton belonging to a teenage boy with spina bifida, a condition that had left his legs paralyzed. He couldn't hunt. He couldn't contribute physically to gathering food. And this was a group that moved constantly, following seasonal patterns across the landscape, which meant every single time they relocated, someone had to carry him. That's not a small burden. It's a repeated, deliberate choice made over and over for years. He lived well into his teenage years, cared for the entire time, and when he eventually died, he received the exact same respectful ceremonial burial as everyone else in the community. There was no shortcut taken because he couldn't contribute in the way others could. The genetic analysis revealed one more layer to this story. Rather than studying just a single individual, researchers compared DNA samples pulled from brains spanning the entire 300-year period the site had been in use. What they found wasn't the kind of genetic diversity you'd expect from a large, open community absorbing new members from surrounding areas. The sequences were remarkably consistent across centuries. This wasn't a loose collection of unrelated families sharing a convenient burial spot. This was one extended family line, related by blood, returning to the same water source across dozens of generations, with almost no genetic evidence of outside individuals joining the group. In an era when contact between separate human populations was rare and difficult, this community had remained tightly closed, intermarrying within itself and preserving both its bloodline and its burial tradition for well over a millennium. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It reflects a conscious, repeated choice, generation after generation, to maintain a connection to this specific place and to each other. Not every discovery at the site pointed toward peace and compassion, though. One particular burial, catalogued as Grave 102, told a very different story. It belonged to a man in his late 20s or early 30s, someone who should have had decades of life still ahead of him. Buried alongside him was a spear point carved from deer antler. Initially, researchers assumed it was simply a grave offering, a weapon left with him for symbolic reasons. Then a closer examination changed everything. That spear point wasn't placed beside the body. It was lodged inside it, driven deep into the pelvis with enough force to remain locked in bone for 8,000 years. A forensic pathologist studying the case applied the same kind of analysis used in modern crime investigations. The angle of the wound came from below, ruling out a spear thrown from a distance, since a thrown weapon typically strikes at a downward angle. This wound suggested the man was already on the ground when the weapon was driven into him. There were no signs of healing, meaning this happened at or very close to the time of death, though it likely wasn't the fatal blow itself. The actual cause of death was probably a strike to the torso that left no trace on the bones, but the story didn't end there. His skull was completely missing, along with the top few vertebrae connecting the skull to the spine, while every other skeleton found at the site remained fully intact. The fracture patterns on the remaining bone matched the marks left by cutting with a sharp stone tool, followed by deliberate force to fully separate the head. In plain terms, this man had been killed and then decapitated by someone with real skill in cutting through bone and tissue. Given how sparsely populated this region was at the time, this almost certainly wasn't the result of large-scale conflict between rival groups. It reads more like a personal act, a grudge, a dispute, or an act of individual violence carried through to its final, brutal conclusion. Somewhere within a community capable of carrying a disabled teenager across the landscape for years and weaving fresh burial cloth for a dead infant, there was also room for a killing violent enough to end in mutilation. Both of these truths existed within the same group of people at the same time. That contradiction isn't unusual. It's deeply, unmistakably human. Step back and look at everything this one small Florida pond actually produced. A cemetery holding 168 people, preserved for 8,000 years in conditions that should have destroyed them almost immediately. 91 intact human brains. Genetic material that, at the time, ranked among the oldest human DNA ever successfully extracted anywhere in the world. The oldest woven textile ever found across the entire Americas. A genetic record proving unbroken family continuity across 13 centuries. And buried within all of that, a fully solvable ancient homicide case, cracked using the same forensic logic applied to modern crime scenes. Individually, each of these findings would have made headlines on its own. Together, they add up to something far bigger, a complete, detailed portrait of a society nobody expected to find. These weren't simple, struggling people barely holding on at the edge of survival. They were a fully developed community with skilled craftsmanship, deep spiritual beliefs, strong family bonds, and a clear sense of ceremony and identity, all thriving in Florida thousands of years before anyone imagined a society like this could have existed there. The DNA didn't just confirm what the bones were already suggesting. It went further, proving that this wasn't a temporary population passing through the area. This was a people permanently rooted to this specific location, not in the sense of living there full time, since the isotope evidence clearly shows they migrated seasonally, but rooted to it spiritually and genealogically. This pond functioned as the anchor point their entire identity revolved around. They roamed widely across the peninsula, but they always came back, and the consistency of their DNA across so many generations is the physical proof of that loyalty. There's still a much bigger question left unanswered. These genetic sequences belong to a population that had clearly already been living in the Americas long enough to develop a distinct genetic identity, separate from the Asian populations their ancestors originally came from. That means the journey across the ancient land bridge from Siberia, the long migration southward following retreating ice, and the eventual settlement into distinct regional communities, all of that had already happened well before anyone was buried in this bog. By the time these specific individuals were laying their dead to rest here, they were already an established ancient American population with deep roots of their own. How far back that lineage actually stretches, and what other communities may have existed alongside them elsewhere on the continent, remains an open question researchers are still working to answer. Genetic databases keep expanding, and extraction techniques keep improving. Recovering ancient DNA from hot, humid environments was once considered nearly impossible for the exact reasons that made this discovery so unlikely in the first place. Today, it's an active, growing field, largely because one ordinary-looking Florida pond proved that assumption wrong. There are almost certainly more sites like this one still waiting to be found, each one carrying the potential to reshape what we think we already know. All of this began with a construction worker who happened to notice something slightly out of place while operating heavy machinery. What followed was decades of careful, painstaking science, and it's still not finished. The people buried in that bog never could have known their remains would one day be studied by forensic experts, geneticists, and archaeologists thousands of years in the future. They were simply people, real, individual, irreplaceable people who wove cloth, honored their dead with ceremony, cared for those among them who couldn't care for themselves, and kept returning to the exact same water for longer than most nations in history have managed to survive. The bog preserved their bodies. The DNA gave them back their voice. And what it revealed wasn't some primitive, distant version of humanity standing apart from us. It was the same humanity we recognize today, running on the exact same kind of mind, driven by the same instincts to love, to grieve, to protect, and sometimes to hurt one another. It just took 8,000 years and the right patch of Florida swamp for any of us to finally see it clearly.